Right, comrades, thank you very much for that, and thank you also for the reception you gave me when I tottered in here, or rather was wheeled in here this time last year. I've been trying for 40 years to get a standing ovation from a socialist audience, and completely failed until I realized that all you have to do really is burst a blood vessel and say nothing at all. And then you're certain of it. And before I start, I just wanted to say that there's a placard up here which caught my eye, you see there, for the Leicester East Manufacturing Science Federation, the MSF, which has a quotation there from Shelley, reading, I think, something like, "Rise like lions." Do you see that? I just wanted to point out that the lions in that quotation are reference to the animals in the jungle, and have nothing whatever to do with the General Secretary of the MSF, who's apparently spent the last 5 years or so stealing money from the Union. Now, why am I speaking about the suffragettes? The answer to that is very simple, and that is for 10 years now I've been writing a book about the relationship between property and votes, the undemocratic nature of property and the democratic nature of voting for governments. And I've just completed, fortunately, I didn't think I was going to complete it, but I have now completed the first section of that, which is how the vote was won. And the last section of that is how the vote was won for women. So that's why I'm speaking on this subject. There's no other reason whatsoever. I start really in 1884 with the Reform Act of 1884. And the position after the Reform Act of 1884, and I just want these figures to stay in your mind in case they're disputed. Roughly speaking, 66% of the men in the country were able to vote for their government. That's in some doubt. It could have been 63, it could have been 67. What's in no doubt at all is that 0% of women were entitled to vote for their government. And when you look at these figures over more than 100 years, it seems really quite incredible, quite preposterous that that should be the situation. And why? What's the reason for it? And if you look through the debates in the House of Commons from 1867 onwards, when this matter was first raised, you do get a view, which comes from the Tory and Liberal benches, that the superiority of men over women, certainly in the political field, is something that was ordained by the Almighty. It's not something that you can dispute. There was a man called Earl Percy, whose family came over with William the Conqueror and has been conquering ever since. In fact, they're still conquering away, who explained it like this, going deep into the intellectual recesses of his mind. The real fact is that man in the beginning was ordained to rule over women, and this is an eternal decree which we have no right or power to alter. Not much point in having a debate at all, you might think, after that. That was the position from the extreme right. Here's a quotation from what would have been at that time the extreme left in the House of Commons. Henry Labouchere, the radical MP for Northampton. The other MP for Northampton was Charles Bradlaugh, the great atheist campaigner. This is what Labouchere had to say on this subject. The mission of a working man's wife is to look after his home, to mind the baby, to cook the dinner and do the washing. She has no time for electioneering. The business of a husband is to take an hour off, go to public meetings, and, if he is a wise man, accept the radical principles addressed to him. That was the view of the, if you like, the standard view of the radical position in the House of Commons at that time. Although the majority of the House of Commons did support some kind of universal suffrage, some kind of women's suffrage during that early period, that view of Labouchere on the one hand and Percy on the other was consistent, that it was ordained that women were different to men and men were superior to women. Now, exactly the same year that 1884, the same year of the Reform Act, there was a man called Frederick Engels who was working on a little book called The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State. And he took a different view of the reasons why men in society are superior to women. His view was that it was not natural at all. It was nothing to do with anything natural, but that there were physical and scientific reasons for it, to do with physical strength and the rearing of children, and the division of property in society and the control of the surplus of property in the society. And his conclusions were that women, first of all, had not always been inferior to men, and secondly, that they need not always be inferior to men, but it was important to understand why they were inferior to men, circumstances which could be changed. He stressed this over and over again, at least 3 times in that little book. You'll find something very similar to this quotation. The emancipation of women and their equality with men becomes feasible only when women are enabled to take part extensively in social production. In other words, what was going on in the society, the production that was going on, the production of the surplus, was crucial to the control, to understanding why women were in the position that they were in at that time in 1884, and why they need not always be like that. And that's a sort of quotation which really runs through this entire argument, needs to be borne in mind during the whole story of this. If you have that Engels, little book of Engels in the back of your mind, then it's much easier to grasp what happened. Now, from 1867, which is the first time this was raised in the House of Commons, onwards, all the way until the vote was eventually granted to women, or to most women, in 1918, there were 3 phases of the campaign for the vote. The first phase was what you might call the constitutional suffragists. That was an argument that came from the top of society, from people who operated mainly in drawing rooms or in and through the men who were in the House of Commons. They tried to get the vote for some women. And one of the problems with that early stage is that because they were always arguing with one another, because they were at the top of society and arguing with one another about the tactics, they were constantly making hideous compromises with the question of the vote. Not all women should get the vote, certainly not. How many should get it? At one stage, they even conceded the most extraordinary compromise of all, which was that married women shouldn't have the vote. That was conceded effectively by the campaigners. And Sylvia Pankhurst summed up this entire period, Sylvia Pankhurst's great book, The Suffragette Movement, which is still, in my view, the best account of the whole period, sums up this entire period by pointing to the fact that the whole campaign was in the hands of a few people at the top of society, and saying that as a result of the thing being at the hands of a few people at the top of society, the campaign went from timidity to timidity. And the second phase, which starts exactly with this century, in fact it starts on May the 1st, 1900, almost exactly 100 years ago, is the period which is called the radical suffragists. Now, I use that phrase, which is not used by most of the historians and wasn't even used by the people at the time, but it's used by Jill Lidington and Jill Norris in their famous book. I think it's now a famous book, One Hand Tied Behind Us. In fact, you won't really understand this argument at all unless you read that book, understand the development of what happened. May 1900, in Blackburn, which was at the centre of the area where most women were employed, that is, where most employed women worked, and certainly where most women were in trade unions where they worked. In Blackburn, there was a petition saying that it was absolutely wrong to continue to refuse the franchise to women. And that petition was taken around the clothing industries of Lancashire, Cheshire, and to some extent Yorkshire, by a handful of individuals, some of whom were middle class. I don't think it matters very much what the class origin of these people were, many of whom were working class women, who took this petition round to the mills. They collected at the station, they went round up to the workplaces, they went round to people's homes, and they gathered in a petition in a very standard, if you like, working class form of agitation. Patient, argumentative, dealing with the democratic arguments for the way in which the thing should continue. People like, I'll throw in some of these names because you'll hear them all over the place: Eva Gore Booth, Esther Roper, Helen Silcock, Selina Cooper, some of them working class, some of them coming from a different class, but all of them operating around the working class and seeking to change things in, if you like, the standard way in which things did change from the bottom in society. Don't forget that 1900 petition is the same year as the formation of the Labour Party, or the Labour Representation Committee, at any rate, in 1900. Didn't develop to a big parliamentary party or to a substantial parliamentary party till 1906. But this goes side by side with that. The development of Labour and the development of the argument for women's suffrage go side by side together. And in May 1901, Helen Silcock took the petition down to the House of Commons, where there was a man MP that was prepared to submit it. It had 30,000 signatures on it, considering they were all working class women and all trade unionists. That was a very substantial amount of people for that area. Now, the trouble with the Liddington-Norris book, in my view, and this is where it starts to get a little controversial, the trouble with it, I think, is that it suggests that really that's the end of the story, that there was a little bit of a working class agitation in Lancashire and Cheshire, resulting in a vast petition in 1901. And that really, and that went on. It went on right up till 1906, when a Liberal government was finally elected. Between 1901 and 1906, it suggests that went on, and then it petered out. And really, the extraordinary thing about the book is it is as though the argument for women's suffrage stopped, or almost stopped, in 1906. That's the problem, I think, with the book, that it doesn't take it on from there. But there was a development which, of course, the book acknowledges. It'd be possible not to acknowledge it, and that is that one of the fragments of the radical suffragists, a fragment starting in Manchester, was an organisation called the Women's Social and Political Union, which started in October 1903. And that was started in the home of a widow called Emmeline Pankhurst, whose husband had been a great ILP campaigner and a doctor in Manchester, and her children. Chief among her children, worth mentioning at this stage, are her daughters Christabel and Sylvia. Now, why I say that is that the WSPU, although it was anxious to distance itself in some way from the ILP tradition out of which it came out of that tradition. The actual members came out of that tradition. But their attitude was different, if you like, to that of the majority of the radical suffragists, and it led to a lot of very furious arguments at that time. There was an impatience with the fact that Parliament weren't proceeding, even though the majority of people in Parliament were in favour of some kind of women's suffrage, that Parliament weren't proceeding to grant it. And there was an impatience, a feeling, well, we can't wait forever. We better get on and do something about it. Something has got to be done. And as a result of the impatience and the anger, there was also a breach with the, if you like, the traditional form of working class petitioning and working class agitation. A different form of petitioning and agitation developed in the WSPU. Now, it took a long time for it to develop. It didn't really come to a head until October 1905. I mean, the notion of that there was a new form of protest, a different form of protest, didn't come until October 1905, when Sir Edward Grey, the Liberal magnate, went to speak to a huge meeting at the Manchester Free Trade Hall. And he was speaking away in a pompous way in which they used to speak at that time, when suddenly he noticed a banner going up. A banner? A banner? Wait, this is a Liberal meeting. Sorry, we can't have banners here. There's a banner which says votes for women. Oh, well, we can put up with banners, that's free speech. But then a young woman in a broad Lancashire accent shouts out, "Will the Liberal government give votes to women?" Everybody assumed in October 1905, quite rightly, that a Liberal government was going to be elected with a huge majority, as indeed it was in January 1906. Will the Liberal government give votes to women? So it's a very elementary question. You know, the whole cut and thrust of debate, which is part of the great Liberal tradition. You get a question, you answer it. You get a question, the entire platform, all the big Liberal businessmen of the day, none of them could answer it. They didn't know whether they should answer it. It wasn't a party matter, the question of the suffrage. So no answer came. So as a result of it, these women kept jumping up, not only the woman who'd started off, but the woman next to her. Will the Liberal government give votes to women? No reply. As a result of no reply, will the Liberal government? No. So people started molesting and pushing them about and eventually hauled them out of the chamber, upon which one of them actually spat at the Chief Constable of Manchester. A dreadful assault, to remember, thing happening, and was arrested and charged with breach of the peace. And both of them, it was Sylvia Pankhurst and her friend and comrade Annie Kenny, who was a mill worker in Lancashire, were taken off to prison. That prison case and led to a complete change in the development of the campaign for the women's vote. And it led to a most fantastic agitation. I mean, it's impossible to explain just in statistics, but I'll try a little bit. In October 1906, there were 6 branches of the WSPU. In October 1907, there were 58. In October 1908, there were 158. £60 had been was the total funds of the WSPU in October 1906. In 1910, the total funds were £9,000, and don't think that's £9,000 on today. That's a huge amount of money on today's terms. Thousands of women flocked to join the WSPU, and all of them, or almost all of them, gave tribute to the terrific release of energy which it let out among so many of these women. On June the 21st, 1908, which is Midsummer's Day, 250,000 people, minimum, 250,000 women, mostly women, not all women, but mostly women, demonstrated in Hyde Park under a Votes for Women, under a WSPU placards. And this policy of protesting publicly, particularly at the public meetings of Liberal cabinet ministers, because the Liberal government was elected in 1906 with a huge majority, led to increased amount of harassment and imprisonment. 191 weeks were spent in prison by what we can now call suffragettes, since that was started by the Daily Mail, one of the few things ever done by the Daily Mail which actually went down in history. In 1907, 191 weeks were spent in prison in 1907, and by 1909 that had gone up to 350 weeks. And in the first 6 years of the WSPU's organization, there were 100,000 public meetings. The Albert Hall, the biggest hall in the country, was filled 13 times, which is 4 times more than all the other political organizations and political meetings from everywhere else in society. It's difficult, I mean, there's so many statistics that it's difficult to express it, but it was a massive, massive agitation which affected hundreds of thousands of people and brought them into politics for the first time. It brought women into politics for the first time. It gave them a voice so that they spoke out openly, that they got used to the constant heckling and sexist tripe which was hurled at them from all over the place. They got used to dealing with it and turning it back on the heckler. They became experts at dealing with that. In particular, Emmeline Pankhurst did that, and she and Christabel were remarkable speakers. There's a very good description by Margaret Thomas, who was the daughter of a Liberal MP in South Wales, of Emmeline coming to speak at a meeting in Newport, which she, Margaret Thomas, had spoken to a few weeks before. When Margaret Thomas spoke there, she was the daughter of the Liberal MP, a lot of Liberals, so-called Liberals, came to the meeting with musical instruments and started the musical instruments the moment she started to speak. The WSPU has said, you've got to go on for an hour. She went on for an hour against this complete cacophony. Nobody could hear a word she said, and then they closed the meeting. When Emmeline Pankhurst came to the same meeting just a few months later, they started the same musical instruments, the same interruptions, and she took them one by one and dealt with them. Made them stand up, say, where do you stand? What's your position? Humiliated people publicly, made everybody laugh at them, so that by the end of the meeting, everybody was laughing at the hecklers and not at the person who was speaking. And all this culminated in this period in a court case in which Christabel and the others cross-examined the Liberal Home Secretary in the House of Commons. They were charged with breach of the peace, and they cross-examined them, showing how these Liberal, Herbert Gladstone in particular, the Home Secretary, had all said in the past that the only way you ever got anywhere in this life was by breaking the law, by force majeure, showing that these cabinet ministers had all said this in the past. And as a result of, poor old Herbert Gladstone was made to look a complete fool in the cross-examination by Christabel Pankhurst. All this made a tremendous difference to the advance of the WSPU. I can't emphasize enough just how far that advance went. Now, in that period, the high watermark of the movement, which was 1906 to 1909, particularly those last 3 years, 7, 8, and 9, when all this was going on, these massive demonstrations and this huge agitation, there was no support from the Labour Party. In fact, there was opposition from the Labour Party. Why was there opposition to the Labour Party? And here we come to the area where there might be some controversy, and I've coined a little phrase called OSTAM. OSTAM stands for on the same terms as men. The demand of the WSPU was for votes for women on the same terms as men. And against this motion for OSTAM, whether it was moved in a trade union branch or wherever, were put amendments which were designed to destroy the original operation. It denied to destroy the notion of votes for women in general by saying we're in favour of universal suffrage. I'll come to that in a moment. The amendments were all for universal suffrage, and in the Labour Party conference, 1906, 1907, 1908, and 1909, there are amendments moved to motions, mainly coming from ILP people, because the ILP throughout this period supported the WSPU and supported the WSPU demands. There are amendments to the motions placed by people like Harry Quelch. Harry Quelch was a socialist in our tradition, if you like. He was a Marxist. He was a member of the Social Democratic Federation, the SDF, and he moved on each occasion that anyone came up with a motion for supporting the women's campaign. He moved an amendment for universal suffrage. And all these three occasions, 1906, 7, and 8, Quelch described OSTAM, that is, the demands of the WSPU, that is, for votes for women on the same terms as men. And this is the phrase I want you to try and remember, as a retrograde step which must be opposed. And the Labour Party supported him by a small majority in 1906, by a bigger one in 1907, and by an even bigger one in 1908. Now, the argument, which seems sophisticated, the argument was that if you just gave votes to women on the same terms as men, the result of that would be that it would tip the class balance in favour of the ruling class and against the workers, because propertied men had the vote, or men with some property. They weren't propertied men, but there were property qualifications for men having the vote. And if you moved those same qualifications onto women having the vote, then you would tip the class balance in the society and their representative institutions in favour of course, that was the argument that was placed by Quelch, people like Quelch and others, without any regard for the counter-argument, which was that what you were dealing here was a question of discrimination. Absolutely elementary, obvious to everyone here. Men had the vote and women didn't. What could be more obvious than that? And the argument was that women should have the same vote at the same terms as men. So that was the way in which the argument flourished. There was a man called Victor Grayson, who some of you will have known about, who was a socialist who was elected MP for Colne Valley. And he bitterly opposed, not only most of the women, not all the women, but most of the women opposed Quelch and the others. Harry Quelch raises his hands in holy horror because the ladies fighting for the franchise have not been pretty, limp, submissive little things who asked beautifully for the vote. When we meet a hungry man who is so hungry that he cannot be attended to without a 7-course dinner, we say, as we cannot give you that, it would not be fair to give you bread and cheese. That is identifying the absurdity of an argument which says, because we can't give you the lot, you can't have any of it. But there was a further argument, which I stress again, that the argument for universal suffrage, it seems elementary, doesn't it? Anybody can say, do we want universal suffrage or do we want just votes for propertied women? It's obvious that we're in favour of universal suffrage. Everybody is in favour of universal suffrage, or should have been at that time. And therefore it was obvious that if you say, oh no, we don't want that, we want universal suffrage. The point is that on each occasion, these amendments and this argument was used not to extend the argument for universal suffrage. Indeed, there was no mass campaign for universal suffrage during the whole of this period. Even though the SDF international organization was committed to campaigning for universal suffrage, there was no campaign. There was a Universal Suffrage Society led by a Liberal minister, former Liberal minister. And aside from that, there was really no campaigning, no agitation, nothing at all for universal suffrage. So the argument was used again and again to frustrate the women's cause and support for the women's cause, or the WSPU cause, to frustrate any further argument for votes for women, rather than for any other purpose. I'm not saying there weren't people who were in favour of universal suffrage and preferred it, but this didn't show itself in any sort of campaign. So if you ask the argument, what line would we take today, and that is an argument which might lead to some controversy, of course there's no argument between universal suffrage or Ostend. There's obviously no contest between the two. But when you look at the reality of the situation at the time, the extent of the agitation, see, it seems to me again and again we're confronted with questions like this all the time in our ordinary political lives. We're confronted with questions which aren't put the way we want to put them. It's not saying, are you in favour of universal suffrage? Yes, we're all in favour. The question is, are you in favour of votes for women on the same terms as men, which puts an end to 50 years of blatant discrimination and moves the thing a little bit forward? Are you in favour of that, or are you not? And those who said we are in favour of universal suffrage on the whole were saying, are you not? I just make this point in passing. I'm not making any particular accusation against Harry Quelch, although I think it does apply to him. There were in the Labour movement at that time a large number of people whose arguments on this question were polluted from start to finish by misogyny. I mean, blatant misogyny. I refer to Belfort Bax, the worst of them all. Now, he's singled out by Engels as being a frightfully nice chap, by the way, just in case you think I'm taking someone from the extreme right. And there's this little book called Essay in Socialism, New and Old. Belfort Bax definitely thought that the end of the world would start if women had the vote. And the reason that he thought that was because he thought women had smaller brains than men. He definitely thought that. He argues it most passionately in Essays in Socialism, New and Old. Women have smaller brains. It's like the blacks in America, he says. You can't give these sort of people the vote. And that's why he was so much opposed to it. And underneath all this argument, in my belief, was a running sore of misogyny among many of the Labour Party spokesmen, which left this divided, as it were, the Labour Party from this great agitation. I'm not saying that there wasn't a great deal of overlap. Well, I'll come to the overlap in a moment. Because I'm saying on the second point, that seems to me the first point I want to make. I can only pick out a few points from this long story. The second point, which, in a sense, if you're to attach blame historically, and there's not much point in attaching blame unless it helps us to how we deal with similar questions today. If you're attaching blame in that sense, you can attach it, I think, to the spokespeople for the Labour Party, the people who were speaking for the Labour Party at that time, Quelch, Bax, and all the others. On the second question, the blame shifts completely in another direction. And that is the question, because up to 1911, there really didn't seem to be anything else going on. I mean, slight exaggeration, but nothing really big going on in the general political situation than the Votes for Women campaign. From 1911 onwards, something else happens, which is of a completely different order. It was known then, and it should be known now, if you like, because it's a good name, as the Great Unrest. In 1911, a strike started in Southampton, among the seamen in Southampton, which developed into a series of strikes and agitations such as which the country hadn't seen before, certainly since the Chartists. I mean, a quite incredible outburst of militancy. And it was a militancy which, of course, the employers assumed would be like 1889, a flash in the pan, the big dock strike, and then that flash, that was over. It wasn't over. It went on 1911, 1912, 1913, all the way up to the beginning of the First World War. This agitation was bubbling under the surface, constantly coming to the top. And it is interesting, I think, as that the attitude of the WSPU to this. I'm not going to read out a long quotation, so I'll just summarize it simply by saying that the attitude of Votes for Women, the paper of the WSPU at that time, was that the strike was a bloody nuisance, that the strikes should be opposed, that the strikes were dealing with class matters, wage matters, matters of wages, which could be dealt with much easier when people had the vote, and that people were, in fact, they ended up by being against the agitation and against the strikes because they said male workers have the vote and women workers don't. I mean, that was the approach of the WSPU to what was a real possibility of change. And just one very short quotation, which I'll read, because there are these articles in the Clarion, which was the socialist paper of the time, which was selling about 40,000 a week. And Robert Blatchford, who was the editor of the Clarion, found a woman who later called herself, well, she called herself at the time Rebecca West. That wasn't her name. She became famous later. It doesn't matter that she became famous. Forget about that she became famous later. The articles she wrote in the Clarion in 1912 and 1913, many of which deal with this question, are absolutely exceptional and wonderful articles. And one of the things, just one thing, I'll just take one sentence just on this question. Every woman who has risen from the floral stage of political activity, that is the Primrose League, or the vegetable stage, that is the Women's Liberal Association, must admire the suffragettes. Yet we may wish that they had spared a little of their dear irreverence and blessed pluck to stir up the industrial women to revolt. Now, there were plenty of industrial women in revolt, actually. Didn't need stirring up by suffragettes or anyone else. The women of Bermondsey, for instance, were out pretty well. Every plant in Bermondsey which employed women came out on strike in 1911 in a whole rash and massive rash of strikes, just like the school strikes in South Wales, or all the strikes in the docks where people were rejecting, when their claims were met by the employers, rejecting the acceptance of their claims. So great was the agitation at that time. The Bermondsey women were out in force, and there was something like 11,000 occasions in which there was some kind of action. And again and again, they won their actions, these women. So there were plenty of women in action at that time, but Votes for Women ignored them, or almost ignored them. Not completely, but almost ignored them. They weren't interested in this activity that was actually connected with that business of women being part of production, which Engels had referred to earlier. Of course, there was an overlap all the time. Sylvia Pankhurst very much favoured the strikers. There's a wonderful description in one of those Rebecca West articles of Emily Davison, the woman who died on the racecourse, being killed by the King's horse on the racecourse. And Rebecca West remembers meeting her first when she was collecting money for the dockers. Little signs like that there were many suffragettes and many women. If you read that book that Ralph Darlington's written an introduction to about Molly Murphy, she was an organizer for the WSPU in Sheffield, and yet she wrote her account of her life. She says she became a socialist while she was a member. That it doesn't see any difference between member of an organization which distanced itself over and over again from Labour and the Labour movement. She didn't see any particular difference. So there is an overlap all the time, but the central point is that the movement, the WSPU, separated itself from one of the few organized powers which actually could have changed the situation. So the suffragette movement from 1912 to 1914 plainly gets weaker and weaker. I mean, it's a period of terrible repression. The Liberal government got more and more authoritarian, more and more confident that it could smash the suffragettes. It introduced, for instance, in 1913, the Cat and Mouse Act, whereas people were sent to prison and then released only so long as they could recover from their hunger strikes, and then sent back to prison again. One of the most nastiest pieces of legislation ever brought in by any government ever. But so the thing got weaker, and as it got weaker, so it lost its support among many sections of the women that had originally supported it. Sylvia Pankhurst being obviously the one you would think of most, who went off into East London to form a different form of women's suffrage movement, which is founded on working class activity and working class agitation. Now, when the war comes in 1914, you have a situation where the vote has still not been conceded, not even in words conceded, and you have another situation in which the Pankhursts' single-mindedness, their assertion that they were single-minded for the vote, changes in this sense, that they become single-minded as recruiting sergeants for the war. All the way through, they were recruiting for the war. Emmeline and Christabel, those two, became the great favourites of the Liberal government. They were put on platforms all over the country, trying to get people to recruit so that they could go and get slaughtered in the trenches. And that development is the first development you'd notice in the war. But the second development, which is even more important, refers back to that quotation from Engels that I referred to earlier. Women trade unionists in 1914 numbered 357,956. In 1918, 1,086,000. 750,000 employed in munitions, 594,000 in engineering. In Woolwich Arsenal, there were 14,000 people employed in 1914, all men, no women at all. In 1918, there were 100,000 people employed at Woolwich Arsenal, 50,000 of them women. 25% of the women that had previously been in domestic service, the most exploited section of all, perhaps, of the women at that time, had moved, and they'd moved precisely into that area which Engels had been identified as being crucial to any general movement. They'd moved into the area of social production. And in many ways, the most interesting thing part of all this story is the fact that in the war, the great chauvinists and the great imperialists suddenly had a different attitude to the people that were being killed in the trenches. Carson, the man who'd led the Great Orange Revolt in Northern Ireland, led a movement in the House of Commons demanding that people in the trenches should have the vote, because they suddenly realized that all these people were going and dying for their country and none of them could even vote for their government. So this they thought was absolutely shocking. We must change this. And so he demanded votes for our men in the trenches. If men are fit to fight, they are fit to vote. That was the slogan. And as a result of setting up a whole series of committees and select committees and looking into the question, the government really conceded. But they couldn't only concede that. If they conceded that the men who were fighting in the trenches are entitled to a vote, what about all the women who were working in the trenches, if you like, were working particularly in the munitions? And even Asquith, the most stalwart opposers, even Asquith came round in favour of it. And so, in the end, quite simply, after a speakers' conference which lasted through 1917, 1918, the vote was granted, not to all women, but to all women. For some reason, women under 30 were regarded as more dangerous than women over 30. I mean, I suppose you can understand that. But they were saying, well, we won't give it to women under 30. But 1918, 6 million women were given the vote in the Representation of the People Act in 1918, and another 2 million men. And effectively, that's the end of the story. I mean, it's completed in 1928, 10 years later, when they give the vote to the rest of women. I'll just end up with this point. That's the story of it, and it's easy to conclude, and some people do conclude, I think wrongly, but some people conclude that all this took place, the victory, if you like. Engels referred in his book to the historic defeat of the female sex. I think this story is part of the reversal of that defeat. It's the first start of the reversal of it, to the historic victory, if you like, of the female sex, which, of course, is connected up to the historic victory of the working class. But can we look back on that picture and say, oh, well, it would all have happened anyway? There would have been a war, women would have gone into the factories, it would have changed the social position throughout, and that would have meant that the women would automatically have got the vote. Now, I don't accept that at all, and I don't think Engels would have accepted it, and certainly Marx wouldn't have done, because central to all their analysis was we analyze, I mean, men make their own history, and so, by the way, do women. They make their own history. They don't make it just as they please, they make it within certain structures. But they make their own history, and however much the objective conditions may be for giving the vote or advancing one section of the working class or another section, however strong the argument is, unless people do something about it, unless they agitate, and surely this is absolutely central to everything that we stand for, unless they actually agitate and demonstrate and protest and chain themselves to railings and interrupt liberal ministers and all the other things, then these things won't come about. And so, I conclude without any doubt at all that this victory would not have been won had it not been for the agitation for the franchise, for all the suffragettes, all the sections, even going back to the constitutional suffragists, to all the people who ever raised this argument, took part in this argument, yes, and to all the Pankhursts as well, is to all those people, all those many, many hundreds of thousands of people, mostly women, who took this fight on and won it.